How would you feel if one ordinary evening a UFO were to land right next to you? Or how would you react if you woke up with 3 extraterrestrials just a few meters away? Would panic outweigh curiosity? Exactly this happened to some residents of a small village in Romania in the year 1996. If you want to know how this close encounter unfolded, stay with me and I will tell you in detail how it went. Cerțești is a small village in Romania located very close to Moldova. The few hundred inhabitants of the village were mostly simple people who lived off agriculture. Before the internet age, these people's access to information was limited to the 2 public television channels, remnants from the communist era. But even on those, they couldn't see much besides a few soap operas, news, and folk programs. On the evening of July 8, 1996, Police Sergeant Marian Mancu, along with his fellow villager Maricel Rusu, were patrolling the village. The village police had been understaffed for several years, and a few villagers took turns accompanying a police officer on duty. Sergeant Mancu was pleased that Maricel Rusu had volunteered to come with him that evening. Maricel hadn't liked school much and only had 6 years of primary education. He had hardly read anything in his life, but he was a decent guy, always punctual, and never complained when given work. The 2 men started their patrol around 8 p.m. After the sun had set, the stifling atmosphere of the day had cooled slightly. A pleasant breeze blew, carrying the scent of freshly mown hay. They had traversed the village's small streets several times. Around midnight, the village was eerily quiet, interrupted only occasionally by the chirping of crickets. Only a few lights could be seen at some windows. When they reached the village center, Officer Mancu told his colleague to wait for him for 10 minutes while he went home to get something to eat. Maricel Rusu stayed on the side of the road to wait for his colleague. He watched Mancu until he disappeared around the corner of the building where he lived. Left alone, he thought with a little envy of the rest of the village residents who were already asleep. He had no idea that in a few seconds, the world he knew would change forever. He listened to the sound of his colleague's footsteps receding, and then profound silence fell. Suddenly, he thought he heard something. A cold gust of wind blew over his face. He felt a strange shiver running through his body. Without understanding why, he felt enveloped in fear. Suddenly, a whirring sound began to be heard. A strong vortex started, and the tree branches next to him began to move. The feeling of fear intensified, and suddenly, a bright light appeared from above. Turning his gaze to the street, he saw something he didn't even know existed. Under Marcel's stunned gaze, a flying object descended rapidly from the sky and stopped 1 meter above the ground in front of him. The object remained in the air, floating like a boat on water. With his last strength, Maricel threw himself into the ditch at the edge of the road. The object in front of him was round and seemed to have a diameter of 5 to 6 meters and a height of about 2 meters. It had a string of colored lights around it that changed continuously. Sometimes they were green, sometimes red, sometimes blue, almost like they were fading into each other. From underneath emanated a strong white light. Suddenly, around the flying object, 3 small silhouettes appeared, resembling those of 6-year-old children. But they didn't look like children at all. Their heads were much larger than those of children, elongated far back. When one of them turned their head, Maricel saw that they had very large, penetrating eyes. The 3 beings spun around the saucer-shaped craft and murmured unintelligibly. The next day, Maricel would describe what he heard as resembling the sound of rain through a drainpipe. Terrified, he began to pray to God. He was convinced that before him stood the embodiment of Satan, come to punish him. After turning the corner of the building where he lived, Sergeant Mancu headed towards the entrance of the building. Just as he was about to enter, he saw from the street some red and green-colored lights. He felt a breeze, and at the same time, he heard a whirring sound. His first thought was that it was the flashing lights of a police car from the nearby town come for a check. With regret, he realized that he had to postpone his meal break and, quite annoyed by the situation, turned back towards the street. As he turned the corner, he was stunned. Not even 15 meters in front of him was a flying saucer. He blinked several times, thinking his imagination was playing tricks on him. Unlike Maricel, Mancu had read science fiction literature and had heard about flying saucers and extraterrestrials, but he had never believed that they actually existed. Until that moment, petrified with emotion, he saw Maricel lying on the ground in the ditch. A few meters away, he also saw an extraterrestrial moving around the craft. He also noticed the large, elongated head. Upon closer inspection, it seemed to him that it looked like a malformed fetus. Before becoming a police officer, Mancu had been a veterinary technician and knew exactly what an underdeveloped body looked like, with features still forming. He quickly shouted, "Guard!" Maricel raised his head from the ditch, and when he saw the sergeant, he shouted, "Mr. Marian, Satan!" As if by miracle, the three humanoids disappeared, and the flying saucer began to shine even brighter. The vortex intensified, and very quickly, the flying saucer ascended into the sky and headed east. After the departure of the extraterrestrials, the two were so shocked that they couldn't speak. Still dazed, Mancu approached Maricel, who, stumbling, tried to get up from the ditch. The poor man felt very weak. The policeman carried Maricel a little further onto the grass and stayed with him until he recovered. Their shift ended at 6 in the morning, and they still had almost 5 hours of patrolling left. They decided to continue their work because there was no one to replace them on such short notice. Maricel was convinced he had seen the devil and kept asking Mancu if he had seen Satan too. Maricel had seen them more clearly and said that the three were very ugly, had no hair, and seemed to have some kind of sores on their heads. He couldn't remember seeing their noses or mouths. Instead, he noticed that they had very thin hands, about as thick as 2 human fingers, and were dressed in something that looked like silver scales. If they hadn't both witnessed the event, they would surely have thought they had experienced a hallucination. But to have both had the same hallucination at the same time was impossible. Some time ago, before Sergeant Mancu and Maricel's encounter with the flying saucer, 3 kilometers away from the village, Nicu Chicos was on the tractor in the field. It had been very hot during the day, and he and Emil Bugiak had decided to stay until late at night to finish plowing in the cooler air. After midnight, they saw a bright light in the sky and thought they hadn't seen airplanes flying at night in the area for a long time, and not one as bright as that. It seemed quite strange to them, but they didn't dwell on it too much. They felt tired enough and thought they should head back home. After they entered the village, they saw Sergeant Mancu and Maricel walking on patrol. They greeted them without stopping, but to their surprise, the policeman told them to pull over. They didn't quite like it and wondered what had come over the policeman to stop them in the middle of the night. In the headlights, they saw that Maricel didn't seem quite himself. He had a frightened look and didn't say a word. "Did you see anything?" Mancu asked. Surprised by the question, Nicu asked, "What should I have seen?" Visibly agitated, Mancu, who was usually very calm, told them everything that had happened. Immediately, Nicu made the connection with what they had seen. But still, it seemed a bit too much. They had found the strange light they had seen in the sky odd, but tiny little men from another planet sounded downright insane. They knew Mancu to be a serious man, and they had seen that strange light too. On the other hand, they had known Maricel for a long time, and his petrified face spoke volumes that the man had seen something that had scared him to the core. While Nicu Chico saw the light moving over the village from the field, another villager, Gheorghe Gengea, was watching a music festival on TV. His wife and children had already fallen asleep, and he was the only one awake in the house. He was thinking of going to bed himself because a busy day of work awaited him in the morning. Suddenly, the TV image began to first move, and then the device stopped. The first thing that came to his mind was that the power had gone out, so he went outside to see if there was any light from the neighbors' houses. Outside, it was quiet, and there was no light anywhere. He stayed a little longer, then went back inside. The TV was working fine. He decided he must have been dreaming and went to bed without thinking too much about it. In the neighboring village of Kotoroaya, 4 kilometers from the site of the incident, about an hour after midnight, Dumitru Karje was woken up by the dogs barking. When he opened his eyes, he saw a bright light coming from the courtyard. He went outside of the bedroom to see it better. He didn't see any source, just a very extended beam, an extraordinary light, yellow to red. The sky was red, and the ground was red. The light was up, high above the house. It was a light like he had never seen. Even though he was 62 years old, 3 of which were spent in the army, in aviation, he had never seen anything like it. The light was so strong that he could read a newspaper by it. It didn't have a precise shape or source, but enveloped everything. The rays came from somewhere above. They poured out from the west. So it couldn't be the moon. Moreover, the moon was not visible at that time, and the light was completely different from the moon's light. Georga quickly went to check if the animals in the yard were okay. The animals were standing, not frightened. The birds were not heard chirping. Only the dogs were barking agitatedly. After he had stood for a while, he went back into the room, but he didn't wake up his wife or the 2 grandchildren. He stood there for about 3 minutes, on the edge of the bed, looking out the window, thinking, what could this light be? Just as he was thinking of waking up his wife, he saw that the light thinned. It thinned, so easily, slowly, and in about 3 minutes, that strong light disappeared, and only the darkness of the night remained. As we all know, in small communities, time seems to flow differently compared to big cities. Life is peaceful, and people's concerns are adapted to much simpler needs. Their mentality reflects this too. People tend to be much more united, and news travel fast. The next day at lunchtime, the entire population of Cerțești knew in detail what had happened, and the subject was debated from all angles. The word got to a newspaper in the neighboring town, and from there even to the national television station. Suddenly, the whole population found out about the small community in the east of the country. The people became overnight celebrities. Their words were turned upside down, and their psychology was analyzed by all sorts of individuals. The newspapers didn't hesitate to present true narratives or to distort the truth shamelessly. Fortunately, there were video testimonies from those involved, and it was clear as day that these people were telling the truth, having no reason to lie. They were simple people leading peaceful lives, and all the publicity they received brought them no benefit, quite the opposite. Police Sergeant Marian Mancu was 30 years old when the event occurred. Before becoming a police officer, he had been a veterinary technician. Mancu had graduated from the police non-commissioned officer school. He was married, had 2 children, and had no known medical history. Most villagers, including Mayor Gheorghe Nechifor, considered him a serious person with commendable interests in history, and he possessed a fairly extensive library. He had initiatives to equip the village with a monument to the heroes. The sergeant sincerely stated that although he had heard of UFOs before, he had never believed in their existence and had never been concerned with this subject. Guard Maricel Rusu was 41 years old in 1996. He had only completed 6 years of school, but in reality, his education was even lower than that level. His only literary interest, if it could be called that, was to read the sports newspaper. It was evident that he was not interested in scientific or pseudo-scientific issues. Furthermore, he had not heard much about the UFO phenomenon before July 1996. It was therefore impossible for him to invent the details he recounted in his testimonies, which were identical to those reported in numerous other cases of close encounters. Precisely the great similarity between the accounts of the two with the typical phenomenology well known from hundreds of other similar cases, as well as the rigor differences, in a somewhat typical proportion, observed without prejudice and passion, represent very important evidence for the credibility of the whole story. It's true that additional expertise would have been advisable, psychiatric and lie detector tests. However, the hypothesis of intoxication is extremely unlikely. The witnesses did not have the training to fabricate it so convincingly, and the inconsistencies, similar to those encountered in other cases accepted as real, as well as the lack of motivation, exclude these hypotheses. Maricel Rusu is a God-fearing man, without being a zealot or even a practitioner. This also explained the fact that his first hypothesis was that he had seen Satan and the fright that followed this realization. He had never suffered from mental illness. Villagers do not remember him ever lying before. Although he sometimes drank, he was never seen drunk in the true sense of the word. Shortly before the incident in question, the guard's hand had been bitten by a horse. As a result, he was undergoing medical treatment at that time, which required him to abstain from alcohol for 2 months, including that evening. The ugly wound was evident even during the interview on national television. Other debunkers have said that the UFO could not have landed due to the electric and telephone wires on both sides of the road, wires that also cross the road from time to time. Their observation does not hold up. Given the described dimensions, the UFO could have landed and taken off comfortably. From analyzing the accounts of the two protagonists of the incident, several conclusions can be drawn. The event at Cerțești has enough arguments to be classified as a close encounter of the third kind. But can we ask ourselves if it was perhaps even more than that? For example, a close encounter of the fourth kind? A first argument could be that in the days following the incident, Sergeant Mancu felt weakened and out of sorts. He stated that he was afraid he might have been irradiated. Guard Rusu had repeated nightmares. He stated, "For a couple of nights, I dreamed. I dreamed as if I were standing in the ditch, after which he woke up frightened from sleep." He added, "I wouldn't have been scared if I hadn't seen them so ugly, but the way I saw them, I was scared." The two were asked if they had felt a time gap. Apparently, neither of them believes there was any indication of this, which of course does not mean that such a gap could not have existed. However, precise events mapping would have been needed for proof. Unfortunately, Sergeant Mancu stated, "I didn't have a watch on me. I don't wear it because my bracelet broke." Rusu, who also didn't have a watch, believes he saw the object for not even 2 minutes. I say 2 minutes. When the sergeant appeared, they flew away. Neither of them was able to map out the events more precisely. However, there were certain gaps in the continuity of events. Neither witness remembers seeing the creatures descending from the UFO or going back up, nor can they explain where they could have descended or ascended once they did not see the UFO having any doors or other means of access. Maricel Rusu stated, "I didn't see where they could have descended from. They were spinning from then on." Upon departure of the object, the situation was repeated, so that when the UFO took off, the little creatures were simply no longer there without anyone seeing them ascend into the object. The same witness stated, "They disappeared, but I didn't notice how they disappeared. I don't know where they went in, but I didn't see them going in." Sergeant Mancu admits that he cannot explain the disappearance of the little men either. According to his estimation, the observation lasted only 4 to 5 seconds. There are numerous similar cases where witnesses had the impression that a close encounter of the third kind lasted only a few seconds or minutes, only to reveal a much longer close encounter of the fourth kind, later under hypnotic regression. To draw a conclusion, an examination of the witnesses through hypnotic regression or equivalent procedures would have been required. Unfortunately, such investigations were not available to researchers in Romania at that time. Cerțești is a kind of Roswell of Romania. We do not know if state institutions were involved in covering up the event, but we can say with certainty that there were numerous journalists who competed to discredit what happened. Even now, after 28 years since the event, an article appears in a newspaper from time to contest the events. Unfortunately for them, there are video recordings of the testimonies from that time, and these are more than eloquent. Obviously, critical research into UFO events is indispensable to uncovering the truth, but lying and denigration are techniques of cover-up, and fortunately, we know how to tell the difference between them. In conclusion, I want to ask you, what would you do if you were a witness to such an event? What feeling would take hold of you? Curiosity or fear? I would be delighted to read your opinion in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe buttons. Until next time, you better look up.